Hey guys, Deanna Cat here. So I'm here today to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects. If you guys have been following around for a while, you'll know that we love worms here on this homestead. And I think a lot of you guys have been really eager and interested in learning how we vermicompost, which is the name for composting with worms here. So I'm here to talk to you about our method of composting with worms. There's a lot of different types of worm compost setups out there that you can use. There's what they call worm towers that are kind of those stacking units. Some people like to use those, but I'm here to show you what we do and how we've been vermicomposting for over 12 years now. And it's a really simple method. Really all you need besides the bedding and worms, which we'll talk about, is a simple tote bin, like a plastic storage bin, and that's it. So it's really simple, it's effective, and so we'll talk to you about how we set up and maintain a bin like that today. We love composting with worms here. It's a great way to divert some of our kitchen waste and some of our garden waste. They create castings. These are the finished castings here, and don't worry, I'll show you a close-up of all of this too. But these are the finished worm castings. We call this black gold. It's basically what we owe a lot of the vitality and life force in our garden to. It's their poop, basically. So the worms will break down and decompose food waste, but also their bedding. This is rehydrated cocoa core here, or newspaper. These are the kind of materials we're going to put in the bin with the food waste, along with a little bit of dirt from our yard for grit for them. And they just churn and eat through all of that and poop out black gold. And it is a readily available nutrient and well-balanced fertilizer. It's a soil conditioner. It helps promote good aeration and drainage in soil, and it's just really, really great stuff. In addition to adding their worm castings directly to our garden beds, we also make aerated compost tea with their worm castings, which I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about in a different video and different post. So that said, this is all meant to go with a blog post, so I'll write up more of these details and show pictures too. So this is meant to complement that. So to get started, the materials that you're going to need are, one, your container. So this is just a really basic storage tote. This is a 35-gallon size. And when you're choosing a container, you want to get something that's nice and heavy duty. It's nice and sturdy. We got one that has a lid that can clip on. You know, it's kind of a good idea so that rodents and things don't get in there. You want something that's fairly durable. On that note, make sure that your chosen container doesn't have any holes around the top of them. A lot of the storage containers we've seen these days have little holes around the edges, and it can actually allow water intrusion to get inside, and you don't want that. We actually aren't even going to add drainage holes to this, so I'll talk to you more about that in a second. But make sure you have a nice solid lid, and then your size is going to vary depending on your needs in your garden and how much, you know, kitchen scraps and stuff that you have. This is a 35-gallon again. We've had all the way up to like a 50-gallon tote, which is pretty big. We never actually fully filled it, and you can go down as small as probably, I'd say, like a 15-gallon if you had just maybe an apartment. And we have composted even when we were living in apartments before, so this is something that can be used anywhere, no matter where you live. Even if you don't have a garden and you just want to divert your food waste from the landfill, you can turn it into compost and just, you know, give it to friends that do have yards, you know, whatever you want to do with it. So probably no smaller than a 15-gallon. You want to get one that is not transparent, so you don't want clear plastic. So this is just an example because I'm going to show you guys the cocoa core that's in here. Worms like dark. They like to be buried. When you add food to it, you bury it. So you want to make sure that it's a dark bin so that there's no light that can come through. So that's it for the bin. We have drilled holes. If you can see, there are air holes that we drilled with a 1/4-inch drill bit all the way around all the sides. That's just for air for them, but we actually aren't going to put any kind of drainage holes in the bottom here. Contrary to popular belief, you do not need drainage when you properly maintain a worm bin. You control the moisture in here by how much food. You don't want to add really, really wet food, and if you do, you want to add more browns and dry stuff every time you feed the bin, so that's where like the paper comes in. So by maintaining it a nice, even moist consistency, kind of like the consistency of a wrung out sponge. So they like moisture, but worms breathe through their skin, so you don't want it to be overly wet and soggy. So we usually only add just a little bit of actual like water from a hose if it seems really dry, but otherwise a lot of the food moisture in there keeps it wet enough for them. And so if you add drainage holes in the bottom, they're gonna leave. The worms are gonna just go out the holes out of the bottom. Trust me, it's happened before. So we don't need drainage holes. We don't want to capture any extra liquid. People sometimes think that the hole or the liquid that comes out of a worm bin is worm tea. It's not. No offense if it's something that you try to utilize. It's not. microbially active. It's usually anaerobic. It's considered a leachate product. And so when it's a leachate like that, it's not the stuff that you really want to use in your garden. I mean, it won't necessarily do any harm, but it could have gross bacteria in it that you don't want. So again, properly maintained worm bin will be a moisture consistency that doesn't have excess water that needs to drain out of it. When we make worm tea, we actually brew their castings kind of like tea and put that in a bucket with water and aerate it and bubble it and get it all full of life. So it's not the same as the liquid that would maybe drain out of an overly wet bin. So no drainage holes, air holes, whatever container you think fits your size and needs. Probably no more than 50 gallons, 15 gallons at minimum. And you want it to be, this is a little bit deep, it doesn't need to be this deep. Worms will usually stay kind of more towards the surface anyway, so that it doesn't need to be much deeper than this guy. So that's the bin. And then bedding. So this is the kind of material that is called bedding. It's the brown material that's going to go into your bin with the worms. So we have hydrated cocoa coir here. It comes in a brick. I wish I still had one to show you here, but it comes in a hard condensed brick and we rehydrate it. So this is about a 5-pound brick. We actually had a 10-pound brick that I cut in half. So 5 pounds to go in this, and it's 5 pounds when it's still condensed. It's a lot heavier now that there's water in it. But 5 pounds is what we're going to put in this 35 gallons, so you can kind of gauge and adjust how much you might need. Other bedding materials besides cocoa coir that we use are shredded newspaper, so we're going to add that in there as well. And then, as I mentioned, a little bit of our sandy soil from our yard. If you have clay soil, you might not want to add it. It's a little bit sticky, but they need something with any kind of other soil. You can even add potting soil if you need to for grit, and that helps with their digestion. So we're just going to add a good little scoop with that as well. So this is the material that they live in that you're going to bury your food waste in. They actually also eat this material though, so even though it's called bedding, they eat it too, and they kind of blend it and break it all down with their food. Other materials that can be used are leaves, dry leaves, and cardboard, but you want to kind of rip up the cardboard a little bit for them to munch on. And any material that you add to your worm bin, you do want to try to break it up a little bit smaller. They're just going to be able to break it down that much faster. So there's bedding. And then the worms. So I'm not going to pull them out quite yet. I'll wait until we do the close-up of that. But we got a pound, this is about a pound bag or about 1,000 worms from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. So we're going to add those in once we get their bedding into the bin. But the worms that are used for composting are red wigglers, or Yersinia fetida, I think is how you pronounce it. And they're amazing little creatures. So just little fun facts. They can eat their body weight in food per day. So if we're starting with a pound of worms, they can eat a pound of food in a day. And so when you're feeding your worms, and we'll talk a little bit more about what to feed them and not in a moment, but when you're feeding them, that means that they can eat about a pound of food a day if you're starting with a pound of worms. But you want to not give them too much food, so you judge it based on about what they can eat in a week. Because if you put too much food in there and they're not breaking it down, it can get stinky and get anaerobic, and it gets gross. A healthy, well-maintained worm bin will not smell bad. So that said, you can even keep these inside a house. I had somebody tell me the other day on Instagram that they were hiding a little worm bin underneath their sink counter, and their husband didn't even know it was there for like 3 months, and then he discovered it under there. That's how discreet and non-stinky they can be. So what we usually do is feed once a week, and then after about a week you can assess how much they've eaten. So if there's still a bunch of leftover food, you're like, okay, maybe I need to scale back a little bit, because you don't want that food sitting in there and really rotting and getting gross. If you go back in a week or even less than that and there's like no food left and they devoured all of it, then you're going to want to start to feed them a little bit more. So you'll kind of find your right balance based on your worms, because they will decrease and increase in activity based on temperature as well. So speaking of that, you can worm compost in a variety of climates. We've lived everywhere from Chico, California, with crazy hot summers, and in Providence, Rhode Island, while I was in grad school, with freezing winters, and we've been able to successfully worm compost or vermicompost in all of those locations. There's just some extra measures that you need to take, and I go into a bit more detail about that in the blog post, but basically they will be the most active and most happy at about 50 to 85 degrees. They'll slow down in their activity below 50, and they'll slow down a little bit when they're too hot. But the sort of like danger zone for them is above 95 degrees and below freezing. But keep in mind that is the temperature that's actually in the worm bin. The worm bin itself insulates itself a little bit, and if you keep it in the shade away from like some temperature extremes, it will usually be, you know, a few degrees more warm or cold, like more comfortable than the outdoor air. So if you want and you live in a more extreme climate, you can get a compost thermometer and actually monitor the temperature of the worm bin and bedding material itself, not just the outdoor ambient temperature. So just a couple quick tips. Again, I'll talk more about it in detail in the blog post, but quick tips: keeping it somewhere in the shade where it's not getting direct sunlight. In the winter when we lived in Rhode Island, we had it in basically like a uninsulated, virtually outdoor hallway. It was really cold. So we wrapped the bin with either fleece or wool blankets to help keep it insulated. If you get a little bit of a smaller tote than this that's easier to move, you can just bring it inside or bring it into a garage that you know, has a little bit more protection and keep it more comfortable, or them more comfortable that way. In the summertime, shade, you can put, which we're going to talk about more too, is wet newspaper over the top of them. I've even heard of people that live in really hot climates burying water bottles with frozen water down inside the bedding to help keep that nice and cold. So there are some ways, you know, that you might have to intervene a little bit, but you could also just move it inside if you have like a mud room or something like that, and then you can keep them happy all year long. So we talked about the worms a little bit. I'll show you them more close up. And so then the last thing is food. How do we actually feed these guys? So we keep a compost crock. This actually has a filter, so not to be stinky either. It has a carbon filter in here and some air holes, so it doesn't get smelly. And these are some of our kitchen scraps and stuff. And we keep this underneath our sink. So this worm bin lives outside, and then this little guy lives under our sink. So then we can fill it up throughout the week, and then bring it out here and feed them once a week. So the kind of things that worms like to be fed would include green kitchen scraps, you know, but they're not that picky with food, but you do want to be careful not to add too much spicy stuff and like onions. That's kind of the general rule for compost too, is not to put a lot of like onion material and not a lot of citrus. So not a lot of onions and citrus, or like hot peppers. Worms are funny. apparently they don't really like spicy food all that much. You don't want to do processed food, overly moldy food, or anything that's overly really rotten and soggy either. That's going to not only not be great for the worms, but it's going to make your bin get stinky. So we do like a lot of leafy greens or apple cores, banana peels, the end trimmings of, you know, the butt of a cabbage and things like that. The other no-nos is that you don't want to do any animal manure, so no chicken feces, no, you know, cat and dog stuff, and also no dairy products and things like that. Okay, so the last thing that I want to add before we go ahead and add all this material to the bin is that when I rehydrated the cocoa core, I made sure that it wasn't like crazy wet, because again, we're looking for that nice balanced consistency of a wrung out sponge. So this is moist but not too wet, and then once we get everything in there, we'll kind of see how wet it is and possibly add a little bit more water. So I'm going to go ahead, rearrange the camera, give you guys a close-up of all of this material added to the bin, and then we'll get our worms put in there. Okay, so we went ahead and we added our cocoa core in here, so you can see it's nice and fluffy and damp. And then we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna mix in some of this paper. So we'll get some shredded paper in here. I might not do all this, we'll do about half of this here. And get that, whoops, kind of mixed up for them. And so with this, we're not going to be able to harvest worm castings from this for probably a couple months because they're going to need to work to break all this down a bit before it's actually finished worm castings. So I just want to get that mixed as best I can, break up that paper. Okay, and then the other last thing that I want to add in here with this is some of our soil. So this is just our native sandy soil here, just gives a little bit of grit for them. So again, you can even use potting soil if that's all you have, whatever works. So I'm going to get that mixed in. Okay. All right, so that's looking like pretty good worm bedding. Okay, Okay, so now what we want to do when we add our worms is we want to make a nice little bit of a bed for them, even though this is all bedding. But basically, you know, because worms like to be buried, I'm going to make, oh, here goes Ginger. Yay, Ginger! Thank you! But we're going to make a little bit of a bed for them here. and because they want to be buried. So we're going to end up putting the worms down in here and their food and then going ahead and burying them. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the food first and I'll put the worms in on top of it. So that's our little crock. Pour that in there. And now we have chickens. So Aaron went ahead and spoiled the worms and he cut up a bunch of comfrey this morning. So there's comfrey in here, there's some apple cores and then some little bits of, you know, things from our kitchen. There's a banana peel and some food for them. And then again, we'll kind of assess and see how much they go through. And then here's our worms. So I'm going to dig in here. I want to grab a nice big handful for you guys. I'll just dump them in a second, but I want you guys to really be able to see these guys. So there they are. Hi, worms. Welcome, worms. So those are the compost worms. Again, these guys are amazing little creatures. I'm trying to remember all the statistics, but they have something like 7 hearts, and they're hermaphroditic and asexual, and they just reproduce with themselves, and they will reproduce rapidly too. So we start with about 1,000 or a pound here, but they're going to definitely populate really well in this worm bin. So we're going to get those added. Ooh, nice. Look at that nice little ball of worms. And they're not as creepy as people think. Don't be afraid of these guys. They're really not that slimy. All right, so I'm going to get the rest of them poured in there in their new home. Tons of worms. Awesome. I'm excited. And you might be wondering why we're setting up another worm bin too, and that's because our other worm bin got a big old crack. It was like 5 years old, so we needed a new bin anyway, so we figured it was a perfect opportunity to go ahead and show you guys how we do this. But we're also going to grab the worm population out of our old bin and add it to this one as well, so we'll have even more worms in this bin. And then, so they're all in there, they've got some food in there. We're gonna go ahead and give them a cover. So after you feed them, you always wanna cover them up so they can be happy, just as if they were underground, happy little worms. It seems a little bit dry in here, so I might water it a little bit. And then another trick that I wanted to show you guys for when you first add worms to a new worm bin is sometimes they can kind of freak out and they might want to leave. A lot of people see them crawling up the sides, trying to get out. And so to help reduce that and have them kind of settle in here before, you know, they get used to the environment is just with newspaper. So what we're going to do is layer newspaper on top. And then we'll get it wet. And so we'll just damp the newspaper a little bit. Again, I might dampen the whole bin a little bit more too, but then by putting this on top, it kind of prevents them, and it keeps it nice and dark, prevents them from wanting to leave as much. So we'll put a nice little layer of newspaper, and then you can just peel this back when you feed them. I wanted to tell you a couple more things though, so I'm going to take it off for now just so I can show you, but we will add that. So when you're going to actually feed your bin, or your worms, we usually alternate different sides for different weeks. So this time I just fed them in here. Next week, since this side's already low, then I'll go ahead and I'll put food here and then cover it, and they'll kind of migrate back and forth and feed. You can keep feeding in the same spot, that's fine, but when it comes time to actually harvesting worm castings, so say that this is a couple months later and it's finished worm castings, and this is what they look like. So they're nice and fluffy and rich. Basically, again, that consistency of a wrung out sponge. So that is what this entire bin is going to turn into, is these worm castings. So I'll just put a few in here. Why not? Inoculate it with the good stuff, right? So this stuff, once you want to actually harvest it, to keep the worms out of it, and I'll show a whole nother video, I think, and post about harvesting worm castings, because we screen it and we do a few different little things. But one thing that helps get you to that point is that if you know you're getting ready to want to harvest, because that's the one thing that's a little different about this system instead of those worm towers that actually have layers and stacks, is that if you feed them on one side of the bin, they will migrate over to that side and eat just from there. And so if you know you want to harvest soon, keep feeding them on one side of the bin for a few weeks, and then leave one side with basically just finished castings. The worms will migrate over, they'll eat over here, and then you can harvest from this side and screen it out to remove any extra big like food particles that are left over, or big chunks of paper and stuff, to actually utilize your castings. And so that is setting up a worm bin. So I'm going to get this a little bit more moist. I'm going to go ahead and cover these guys, put the lid on, and then we're going to put it in a nice shady location and come check on them probably in a few days, make sure they're still in there, that they're still happy, and that they haven't eaten through all that food yet. Alright guys, well, thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned something new today. I hope this empowers you and makes you feel really excited to get going with vermicomposting at home. And like I said, stay tuned. We will do some follow-up posts and videos on harvesting the worm castings and also making actively aerated compost tea in the short future, hopefully here. And then as far as using these guys, besides making compost tea, we amend a lot of our garden beds with it. So when we're planting new plants, we'll put a little bit, maybe just a small handful per planting hole. When we're like transplanting new seedlings into a bed, put a little worm castings in there. And it's okay if a few little worms and their eggs are called cocoons end up going into the beds with them. That's great, and that's fine as well. You don't want to necessarily intentionally take a bunch of your population and put it into the bed, but they'll get introduced there by adding worm castings to your bed, and then that population will continue to grow and thrive in your bed. And the worms that live in your bed are going to continually aerate and improve and enrich your soil in place as a living compost and living soil amendment in your garden beds. So that is our little tutorial on how to set up a worm bin, and good luck and congratulations on starting to get composting with worms.